This is a recorded interview with James Henry. Today is Tuesday, April the 5th. It's 4 p.m. 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'm James Henry. I've interviewed you before about a year or so, maybe longer. Your books include The Blood Bankers, Tales from the Global Underground Economy, and the forthcoming The Pirate Bankers. You were just featured.
Yeah, there's another book as well, which is called Global Tax Fairness.
Global.
I have it's just been published by Oxford University Press, and I have a very long essay on that.
You're also a former chief economist at the international consultant firm McKinsey and Company, and now a senior fellow at the Columbia University Center for Sustainable International Investment and senior advisor with the Tax Justice Network, which has estimated in their study the price of offshore revisited, that total wealth in tax havens was between 21 to 32 trillion. And we're gonna talk about the Panama Papers, and you are featured in a report by the Four Corners, a group of investigative journalists on this tax haven in Panama.
Right.
And it was leaked from the law firm that's doing it. Sorry, I have too many notes. The law firm that's doing it is called Mossack Fonseca in Panama.
That's correct.
And does anybody know who leaked it?
Exactly. Well, I'm sure that the journalists involved know it, but that's one of the things we do is protect sources. So
right.
We're not speculating about who they are or what their motives were. I mean, it's one of the patterns in this investigating this stuff is that you find that the only reliable revelations come from whistleblowers and journalists. It's law enforcement and NSA and the governments aren't producing this kind of information, and
they're too busy going after the low-hanging fruit.
If that. But we've certainly given them a lot more work to do. So they're going to be having to investigate all this stuff that we've basically uncovered.
Yeah, so this sort of keep people busy, but then again, is anybody ever going to go to jail? Because it's.
Well, the pattern is that we have known about this kind of offshore haven chicanery for decades, and I first ran across this particular firm in 1987 when I was in Panama investigating General Noriega. I came back from that with a complete list of his international phone calls for 3 years, and that ended up being used in his trial. But in the process of that, I ran across this kind of very edgy law firm, which at that point, with many fewer lawyers and had been in business just 10 years. So basically, the U.S. government at that point knew all about these people, but they were allowed to continue to grow. And today they have not just one dictator as a client. They have, we have at last count like 140 heads of state or former heads of state who have been identified as clients of this dodgy Panamanian law firm.
Is the U.S. government involved? I mean, like they're almost accomplices.
I don't think they're involved, but I mean, it's a mystery to me about how this behavior is tolerated. I think that the answer is that it's politics. Basically, you have very wealthy people, very influential government leaders, and plus a lot of wealthy individuals who have been making use of the offshore haven industry. In fact, it's become an onshore haven industry because there's just as much financial secrecy in a place like Delaware. But you find, this industry has exploded in terms of its size and growth and influence since the 1970s when we first were focusing on it. And that can only be explained by a couple factors. One is that these people have political influence. The second is that it's, a lot of the money that is invested through these havens doesn't end up there. Nobody wants to put their hard-earned stolen money in Panama. So most of it comes back and is ultimately invested after being laundered and anonymized. It's channeled through trusts based in BVI or Cayman Islands or Jersey or any number of other of the world's 95 havens. And then it ends up being invested back in the first world. So a lot of the money comes up back to the first world after, or is actually coming from developing countries through these conduits into first world markets. That's where it ends up. So the United States and the UK and Switzerland, they all have a big stake in this game. It isn't easy for them to say, well, we won't accept any dirty money because you're talking about trillions of dollars.
And it was over 200,000 documents.
Well, it's 214,000 companies. The number of documents is 11.5 million documents. It's much bigger than, the Snowden leak or the WikiLeaks stuff.
Right.
This is the largest ever. But in terms of what we're finding, there's a lot to go through and to digest. We've already identified 140 public officials from around the planet. Prime Minister of Iceland just resigned. There's a lot more to go. The Australians have launched investigations of 800 wealthy people who have been using this one law firm to set up shell companies, letterbox companies or trusts that basically operate as a kind of a fig leaf protection for who really owns them.
Right.
And, India has identified at least 500 people using the Panamanian law firm. It's just going to scale up and go around the planet. So we have lots of leading, dictators as well as elected officials who are involved in this. President of Argentina recently elected. His father and brother have been identified as owning a Mosfon, as the law firm is called, Mosfon Company.
The cousin
it's going to grow exponentially. I mean, I think what we see is, more and more prosecutors are getting interested in this stuff that's come out.
And it's the cousin of the president of Syria is also one of the clients, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. He's a cousin of Assad. I mean, he's a big billionaire in Syria, and he's probably using one of these trusts or haven companies to shelter his wealth wherever it was derived from. Nobody's saying that any of this is illegal at this point. It's not for journalists to accuse people of illegality. That's a judicial decision by courts. All we can say is, there's some funny stuff going on here, and somebody ought to look at it.
And this law firm, Mossack Fonseca, they have 30 offices around the world. So
yes.
I mean, they've grown.
Yeah, but I think that they're just one of at least a dozen such law firms and corporate registry services that are set up. If you go to Delaware, there's a couple outfits that are there. That Delaware has about nearly 950,000 companies that are just as secretive. There's no beneficial ownership registration. It's public, so you don't know who owns them. There's 13 American states that now offer so-called asset protection trusts that were modeled on the Cook Islands, which is one of the most secretive trust statutes. There's 49 U.S. states that have LLCs. So, in a way, the only reason people are really ending up with this dodgy Panamanian law firm is because the crooks and kleptocrats of the world probably don't want to be in Delaware. They're sort of more comfortable being in Panama in an odd way. But it's very much like the Star Wars bar scene, where you go in and you see all these different characters sitting around the same facility. There's the money launderers, there's the arms dealers, there's the public officials who have been bribed or stolen money from the public treasury, there's the tax dodgers, and there's the financial fraudsters who have been setting up special purpose vehicles in the Cayman Islands to, be able to lever up their mortgage loans. So there's just all these various kinds of activities that are all basically taking advantage of the incredible financial secrecy, which is actually the ultimate service that these onshore and offshore havens are providing.
I mean, is all they're doing is basically avoiding taxes? I mean, is that like the gist of it, or there's money?
No, as I just said, tax dodging is just one part of the
right. There's money laundering.
There's people who are stealing money from the treasury of their countries. Like the dictator of Angola, who's helping himself to the oil revenues, or President Putin's various games, whatever he is up to in terms of collecting, fees for services in Russia. They're not so concerned with avoiding taxes. Many of their countries are not taxing this stuff to begin with. But they're just stealing money, and they're helping themselves to the public treasury. And so, that's called kleptocracy, the abuse of public office. One of the proposals we've made is to have public officials have to declare their offshore wealth. And it sounds simple, but there are very few countries in the world that actually require public revelations of tax returns and of David Cameron has been. We've been asking that the Prime Minister of the UK have to release his tax returns. He hasn't done so. You'd think that kind of is an elementary request for public officials. They have to disclose where their income comes from.
Talk about that, because it's David Cameron's father was one of the people that are involved. They're one of the clients with this.
He had his father Ian had made a business out of this and set up a company with the help of Mossack Fonseca that was based in the Bahamas, and was basically involved in helping people dodge taxes. We're Cameron still to this day, the son derives benefits from 2 offshore trusts. We'd like to know more about them, but he hasn't really disclosed very much about them. It says it's a private matter. Well, it's not a private matter. When you're a public official, you have a duty to basically come clean and tell everybody where your money came from. Did it come from chicanery, or was it, really earned? We've had that problem in the U.S. elections as well. Donald Trump has not released his tax return. Even Bernie Sanders has not released his tax returns.
Really?
We would like to demand public people running for public office. It's a privilege to be in public office. You got to do some things that ordinary people don't do, so the public can trust you.
Trust, amazing. I just wanted to mention that the FANSECO part of Mossack and Fonseca is he's the advisor to the president of Panama.
Well, he was until the middle of March when he resigned. I think he got wind of this coming out, and so he stepped down. But he's been a pretty active and influential figure in Panama, active in the political parties there, and so I'm not sure that he's entirely retired from politics. But they're probably taking a breather now and trying to figure out how to respond to all this. This has got to be the biggest story that the world's investigative journalists have seen in some time. And, at least until it burns out or there's another scandal or some other headline-grabbing story, he'll be under a lot of pressure.
Panama has a long history of laundering, cocaine and drug money.
Panama is traditionally, Panama was originally a creation of the U.S. government and of the Wall Street law firm. The story of Panama is quite interesting. Back in the 1880s, the French company that was going to build the Panama Canal went broke, and their bonds were bought up by William Cromwell, who was one of the founding partners of a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, which still exists today. But the bonds that he acquired were not going to be valuable unless he could somehow persuade, somebody to build a canal. And one of the problems with that was that Panama was then part of the state of Colombia in Latin America. So what Cromwell went to do, to make a long story short, was he organized a revolution in which Panama had a kind of pseudo-revolution in which it became independent of Colombia. And Panama suddenly became this independent country, which was subject to a lot of U.S. influence. And then he convinced Teddy Roosevelt that the U.S. government ought to build a canal through Panama Isthmus. And so, this was very profitable for the Cromwell and his partners, but it was a good example of where basically Panama was a creation of American interests, of global capitalists in a way, long ago. And then it moved on through various iterations, and ultimately this business of offering sort of financial secrecy arrived by virtue of the fact that there were ships that were transiting through Panama. They had to be owned there. But you also had Americans like John Wayne, the actor, who decided to adopt Panama as a kind of tax residency back in the late 50s. And so, it became known that you could figure out ways, if you were wealthy, to use Panama for tax dodging. But I would say that the real explosion of activity in Panama occurred after it returned to being a kind of dictatorship in the 1970s, and it really had a growth spurt first with the drug traffic, and then with third world lending, which ended up channeling a lot of loans in the form of capital flight back to the first world. And so there was a period in which Panama just really took off in the 70s and 80s in a way that it wasn't a big haven before.
So you also talk about, it's the poorer countries that are the biggest victims.
Well, I think the developing world, basically, when we added up our our estimates for TJN, 21 to 32 trillion offshore, we did, detailed models of 140 developing countries and looking at the sources of uses of international capital. And what we found was that about a third of that 21 to 32 trillion came from developing countries. We were talking about Latin America producing more than 2 trillion of offshore capital flight wealth, and that's invested abroad. Countries like Russia and China have been major sources of capital flight and flight wealth. So it's really the developing world that have been contributing a lot of capital ends up in first world countries, but a lot of it flows through havens. In the last year, we've seen this continue with China. More than estimates vary, but at least $500 billion to $1 trillion have flown out of China in the last 18 months. Much of it owned by the tiny group that runs that economy. And they're, creating a real estate boom in places like Vancouver, where ordinary Canadians can no longer afford to buy real estate because of all the wealthy Chinese who want to park their money. When they do that, they're not investing directly. They're coming through the BVI or holding companies because they want some protection if, the government comes after them. They want anonymity.
You also say that the money, it eventually ends up in New York, Miami, or London. And,
or Vancouver or any number of other, basically back in the first world. I mean, nobody wants to invest in Panama or the Cayman Islands, or, you don't end up putting trillions of dollars in these places. As I just indicated, the money that's flowing out of Hong Kong has been flowing into Canada, is coming through, in the name of, I would say is the way to describe it, in the name of trusts or companies that are set up in offshore havens like BVI, but the ultimate destinations are the first world entities.
So what is the plan? I mean, so journalists, investigators are just going to go and through this. I'm sure the more they dig, the more they're going to uncover, and just see if any crimes are committed or.
Well, I think that's one aspect of it that's important. But I think the most important thing that journalists are hoping for is that they finally clean this stuff up. This is not really not really a technical problem. It's a political problem. It's getting the world community to crack down on tax havens. I mean, there's no reason to have all of these secretive, we call them secrecy jurisdictions because they're really not just tax havens, as I've said before. They're protecting kleptocrats who are not really evading taxes. They're just stealing from the treasury. They're stealing taxes. And there's all these other kinds of behavior that are going on in these places. But it's about time that we basically, as a world, decided to shut them down. I mean, they don't have any rationale in the world economy is not doing better because the global haven industry is 10 times larger than it was in 1960.
And so, so it goes. More and more people, I guess it's going to be uncovered who's actually the clients of this law firm, because it's not just individual, right? It's the way that it works is that this law firm creates corporations that then open up bank accounts, and
That's right.
The original owner of the bank account remains anonymous.
That's exactly right. Yeah. They are able also to create foundations which don't even have any beneficial owners officially. You put your money in a foundation that belongs at least to the Red Cross on paper, and then the board of directors meets, and then they appoint other beneficiaries. But for the purposes of the original founding documents, there is no beneficial owner other than the charity. So that's another game that Mossack Fonseca has really pioneered. This is a misuse of Panamanian foundations. But there's a lot of chicanery that it's kind of like by now it's a bit of a commodity business. There are 95 or so offshore havens. And then there's dozens of states that have gotten into the business. So there's a whole international private banking industry that is, operating this as kind of for-profit business. And they are ever innovative and busy.
Is it true that the original owner of the bank account doesn't even know what the corporate activity is?
Well, that's likely to vary. I mean, I think no. In most cases, the original wealth owner may, if you're going to control your money, you have to be worried about having it stolen by your own bankers. In many of these cases, one of the biggest activities in havens is stealing from customers. So you have to be very careful when you go to a place that actually makes a business out of helping you hide from government, that they don't themselves rip you off. I mean, who's going to enforce your property rights? I sort of feel sorry for some of these dictators in an odd way because, Imelda Marcos, for example, it's hard to believe that she really enjoyed all those shoes, but it was also, she found the hard way that it was awfully easy to put money in Switzerland, but it was awfully hard to get it back. And so, they went to these enormous efforts to feel that they were rich after they, collected all this offshore wealth. And in the case of the Philippines, they did a lot of outright theft from the central bank of the Philippines, which borrowed a lot of money, and the money was sent directly to Switzerland, and the Philippines got stuck with the loans. I investigated that whole scam back in the 80s as well. But, you know, at the end of the day, you sort of wonder why these kleptocrats really bother with all this, because there's an awful lot of adjective that goes along with, you know, having to worry about all these complicated structures and all the various dubious characters you have to deal with in order to try to launder your money.
So just one last question. Do you think the government is going to get involved now and do something?
We have an important election coming up. I'm sure that some people are closer to Wall Street and get much bigger speaking fees than others. And so I think that it's a function really in this domain. I mean, there are a lot of complex issues about who's going to be, you know, who ought to be president, but it's pretty clear to me that we're not going to have, we don't really have a two-party system at this point. We have a bankster party, basically. The banks and the financial services industry in general have much more representation than they ought to have, much more clout. And so I'm not optimistic about anything fundamental being done to clean up this industry. We've had some talk about it on the part of people like Cameron, who declared 3 years ago he was going to clean up the world's secrecy jurisdictions. He did that in the UK in terms of requiring beneficial ownership registration as of this June. But in fact, for British overseas territories like BVI and Caymans, there is no such registration. So this will, if anything, just increase their business.
So like the FBI...
There's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. The United States is not any very close to having Delaware have public registries. I mean, it would take a massive movement on the part of lots of angry citizens to demand, return to the progressive tax system. But I see us heading toward a system in which poor people and middle-class people are subject more and more to unavoidable withholding taxes, excise taxes, sales taxes, payroll taxes, and the rich and the rich and the filthy, are able to become citizens of nowhere for tax purposes.
So I just wanted to lastly mention Irwin Schiff, who is now passed away in prison, trying to educate people about taxes, and some people that actually worked for the IRS, tax agents, were saying that there was no law that even says you had to pay an income tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, you want me to comment on that? I think that's wrong. Taxation is not only an obligation, but I think it's a duty to pay taxes. It's a good thing.
But income taxes
living in a
in
society.
particular.
It's a good thing to be living in a society with a progressive income tax, where those who are better off pay a higher share of the costs of government. We have had experiences with lots of governments around the world, and those that have the lowest taxation as a share of GDP are all impoverished countries. To have a decent society, you need to invest in education and health and security and roads and network communications and culture, lots of vital investments. And we've tried to finance those kinds of investments with debt. We've tried inflation. We've tried privatizing all these government activities. And you end up with a place like Haiti, where there's no public school system, there's no public health system, the roads are, the justice and the courts and the police are for sale. So the libertarian view of the future is a really dreary one, with places like Haiti, where most people have limited resources and the truly rich are well off. I don't think that's the kind of society we should be wanting to leave to our children. it's, it's the same thing that applies to the issue of climate change. I mean, if you basically allow the wealthiest people on the planet to have kind of their own private parks and facilities and, their nature preserves, and everybody else is doomed to exist in a planet that's dying, this is not a good recipe for civilization.
Yeah, it's like, the people that go and follow the system and pay their taxes and do the right thing, that's why the government should go after this, because, I mean, you shouldn't be penalized for going along, and, the people that don't.
Well, that's right. I mean, we've had 30, 40 years of this negative rhetoric toward government. I mean, we live in the United States is not a perfect democracy, but we have basically a representative democracy that's the envy of the rest of the world still. And for us to be critical of government or to just be negative toward taxes are the price of civilization. We may not like everything the government does. We may have a lot of complaints about the quality of government services. But believe you me, it's far better to live in a representative democracy than it is to live in a feudal system where the nobility, rules the roost, has representation without taxation, where in fact the peasants are the only ones who pay taxes because they can't move, and the tiny elite basically is in control. So I think what we've had here is a case of, on the tax side of this offshore haven story and the onshore haven industry, we had a trend toward representation without taxation for the part of the population, tiny 0.1% that owns most of this offshore wealth, and the rest of us are sort of trying to get along. It's a struggle, and unless we have some kind of mass movement, I don't see it changing.
I was just going to say, lastly, because I know that the time is pretty much up. That I mean, their taxes aren't going to to these wars that we're having. At least
no, these wars that we've been having have been in an interesting way. Of course, they're some of the first major debt-financed wars in history. And so you've had this bizarre behavior on the part of the ruling elite in the United States in particular, of people living through another golden age of capitalism, where extreme inequality growing through the roof, tax dodging like you can't believe, at the same time that we're fighting wars. This is outrageous. I think that corporations that don't have a sense of patriotism during this period, they're just taking advantage of every loophole, or individuals who are shading their money abroad because they can, they're just not American citizens. I mean, there's a whole attitude that comes along with being American, which has nothing to do with origin or race or creed. It has to do with believing in political democracy. And part of that price of democracy is you've got to be willing to pay your fair share. Right. And if you're a billionaire, your fair share is going to be higher than that of proportionally higher.
They don't want
somebody who's, as Warren Buffett said, my secretary is paying a lower tax rate than I am, and it's outrageous.
They don't only not want to pay their fair share of taxes, they want to take more than their fair share. I mean, I wonder if the Koch brothers were involved in this stuff.
For 30, 40 years, we've had this free market mythology that, this sauve qui peut attitude of everyone work out for himself is going to make us all better off. There's just no evidence for it. Just absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever. I mean, every time economists try to find any evidence for the Laffer curve, for the benefits of tax cuts, what they find is, there's a short-term effect, and then it all gets eroded away very quickly. There's a thing called tax competition. The United States cuts its corporate tax rate, and Canada responds, the UK responds, and pretty soon everybody is just in a race to the bottom, and nobody is better off.
I mean,
but I've heard as of recently as last week, there are people in Washington advising us, and Ted Cruz is a big proponent of this, so we should become a tax haven ourselves, the United States. Well, this is outrageous, and it's just nonsense. There's no economic justification for it. And it's a violation of all of our traditions. The United States was one of the first to design a very effective progressive tax system. And we were one of the first to prosper under this system. We had very high tax rates in the 50s and 60s and 70s for the most part, during the best periods of economic growth in the history of the country. There's no evidence that all this tax cutting is anything more than short-term benefits.
I mean, it just seems that we live in a country where, the people at the top just get away with everything, and the people at the bottom, like, doing the right thing, are the ones paying the price, and that just needs to be, like, turned around.
Ordinary people have to get involved if they care about this, they care about the future. This is not something that we can wish for. It has to be made. It's
you got to take action.
It sounds impossible, but the whole point is that our job is not to do what's possible, but what's necessary.
So it sounds like
you background. Well, on that happy note, I'm going to leave you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much.
Great. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
So that was James Henry of the
Columbia, right now?
Yes.
Smart guy.
And he's also with the Tax Justice Network.
Yeah, smart guy.
Okay, this is another recorded interview on today, Tuesday, April the 5th. It's 5 p.m., 1 hour before the live show of Organic News on Awake Radio. And I have with me Andrew Hanauer, and you're with the Jubilee USA. And again, we're going to discuss the Panama Papers. And your organization wrote an article, the Panama Papers release highlights need for U.S. shell company legislation. And by the word shell, people mean, like it's a front. I mean, a shell is a front. Some company that's posing as something that's really something else.
Yeah, absolutely. So, our organization, Jubilee USA, we're a coalition of about 75 national organizations, including a lot of major religious institutions here in the U.S. And then we're about 550 faith communities of different faiths around the U.S. So that's who we represent. And we work on issues of global poverty. And so we come to this issue from the fact that all around the world, really poor countries and the people who live in those countries lose so much money every year, about $1 trillion, due to corruption, tax evasion, and crime. And a lot of that money is facilitated by the same sort of systems and structures that were, discovered or uncovered in the Panama Papers leak. So, when we talk about shell companies, we're talking about companies that are set up on paper that don't do any real business, but they, are used as basically a vehicle for moving money.
Right. So it always comes down to the most vulnerable people in the world being harmed by financial secrecy, and I mean even things that aren't so secret. I mean, there's a lot of things that aren't secret, and it's almost like in your face, out in the open, that the vulnerable people are just gonna get screwed.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, if you wanted to say something to that, please do.
Well, I think it's true. I mean, I think the most vulnerable people in our world are almost always the most harmed by the structures and systems that we set up when those systems are flawed. So the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, was devastating to people all over the world, but it was particularly devastating to poor communities, both in the United States and around the world. And those poor communities and the people who live in them had very little, if nothing, to do with causing the crisis in the first place. And so, again, with the Panama Papers, we see the structured systems that are set up to benefit the powerful and the well-connected. And unfortunately, those systems disproportionately harm people who are living at the margins, although they do harm all of us as well.
And so your organization is calling for Congress to pass legislation to make it more difficult to set up anonymous companies here in the U.S.
That's correct. So right now, the United States is one of the easiest countries in the world in which to set up a fake shell company. So to give you an idea of how bad our problem is here in the U.S., there was actually a case where a Ukrainian company was trying to swindle its own government out of money by overcharging it for vaccines. Now, keep in mind, they were doing this during a polio epidemic in the country affecting Ukrainian children. So they were overcharging for vaccines at a time when those vaccines and that money was desperately needed. But to set up this scam, this Ukrainian company created a shell company to launder the money, and they created it not in the Ukraine, not even in Russia or Europe, but they created it in Oregon, because that's where it was easy for them to set it up, and then also to claim the legitimacy of having a United States-based company. So the U.S. has a huge problem of criminals and the corrupt setting up these fake companies here, in our borders. And there's legislation in Congress that would just really simple legislation that would make it harder to set up those fake companies, basically just requiring people to say who their name, what their name is, and their address and show ID when they set up a company. Right now, it's a lot easier to set up a company in many states and not say who owns it than it is to get a library card, and that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Something that came out in this, it was by Four Corners, investigation of these Panama Papers, and I believe it was this man Ian Taylor, who was a client of this law firm, and this, I believe it was this guy that he rented his name. I mean, like people are always worried about identity theft and things like that, and here's this guy like renting his name out. I mean, I don't know if you could speak to that or anything like that, but I mean, I just thought that was like, oh, you can rent your name out. I guess you'd have to have like a really well-known name in order to do that. Like, that's not something the average person is going to be able to do.
Yeah, so there's two really important things, to touch on from what you just said, which is first that these companies are set up right through basically nominees or attorneys or anyone who is sort of a front person for the company, but doesn't disclose and won't disclose who the true owner is. And if you're a law enforcement official and you're trying to track down terrorists and drug dealers and weapons traffickers and human traffickers, it's incredibly difficult to find out who is actually behind these crimes when their money is hidden behind these nominees front people. So that's a huge problem. And then you're right, absolutely. This also exposes just sort of the fundamental unfairness in the international tax system, that you have, as I said, well-connected, powerful people who are able to hide their taxes, sometimes illegally, sometimes legally, and basically, avoid paying their fair share. But of course, ordinary people, ordinary Americans, vulnerable people around the world have no ability, anything like that. And if they don't pay their taxes, they usually end up in jail.
Like Irwin Schiff, who was basically, he died in prison. Did I lose you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought I lost the connection.
Nope, I'm here.
Did you have anything maybe to add about he spent quite a significant time in jail, I believe, Irwin Schiff, for I get like not only not paying taxes, but teaching people about tax laws, trying to simplify it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar
I mean,
with who that is.
okay. Um, so like, what is going to be done with? There's plenty of people investigating it, and what do you think? Do you, I just interviewed James Henry, and I asked him if the government will now do something, because he said the government has known about it for quite some time and didn't do anything.
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing.
But so as far as getting this legislation passed, right? How difficult is that going to be? I mean, it shouldn't be difficult, should it be?
No, you would hope not. I mean, it really does seem like the kind of bill that everyone can get behind. I mean, the good news is it is bipartisan right now in the U.S. House. It's co-sponsored by two members of Congress from the New York City area, one Republican, one Democrat. In the Senate, previous versions have been bipartisan, and we expect to be bipartisan again. And, I think there's a lot of momentum for this. There was a task force in the U.S. House last year focusing on how does terrorism get financed? What are the systems that finance terrorist organizations? And this issue came up repeatedly, that anonymous shell companies are actually a huge part of financing terrorist activity. And so there was a lot of interest, I think, from the right and the left, around stopping these shell companies. So we're optimistic. We're actually bringing, with some of our partner organizations, we're bringing about 70 faith leaders and small business owners from around the country to Washington next week to talk to members of Congress about this issue and hopefully move a lot of them to support our position.
And what do you think? Any chances of any wrongdoers being held accountable and going to jail?
That's a good question. I think it's really fascinating to see. We've seen one world leader already toppled by this, which is just incredible. And by some accounts, something like 10% of the entire population of Iceland was on the streets protesting in the last 24 hours about their prime minister's role in this scandal. So, there's definitely promising signs that this is really going to wake the media up and really, I think, get people aware of exactly how these structures work. I mean, this is such a huge news story, and it touches so many parts of the world, so many different world leaders, 12 heads of state mentioned in this report, that, I think I'm hopeful that it will really, lead to more accountability, more transparency in our system.
Why didn't the government do something if the government knew about it?
The U.S. government?
Right.
Yeah, that's a good question too. I'm not sure. The Justice Department, I think, it's been very active over the years in terms of trying to crack down on some of these corruption scandals. We saw it even with the FIFA scandal last year. I'm not sure yet. I think we're still waiting to find out all the information about all the different pieces that are surrounding this case. But it certainly is something that nobody can ignore at this point.
And so it's pretty large. It's pretty extensive. I mean, it was over 11 million documents. Sir.
That's correct. And so my understanding is that this is, in terms of the size of the data, the number of documents, this is far and away, not even close, the largest leak in world history.
And hopefully the person that leaked it won't get arrested under the Espionage Act.
Yeah, well, and I guess nobody still knows at this point who that was. So we'll have to wait and see how that develops.
Okay, well, I mean, I appreciate your time, Andrew, of the, you're with Jubilee USA. and people can find it's pretty. It's just like a short write up on the Panama Papers on your website, Jubilee USA.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And you know, if people want to get involved, feel moved by this issue and by what was released and how how these powerful actors are able to use the system to their advantage. This legislation in Congress is really a great vehicle for getting involved. So if people want to get involved, they can go to our website, jubileeusa.org, and people can also email me, Andrew@jubileeusa.org, and we're always happy to have more people get involved in this work.
Thank you so much, Andrew
Thanks for having me.
Hanauer of Jubilee USA.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Have a great night. Thanks for publishing about this.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. So that was Andrew Hanauer of Jubilee USA.